Hi, my name is Jenny, and we will be taking a deep dive into neurotransmitters, and specifically, we will be looking at dopamine. So, what is a neurotransmitter? Kind of just to get an overall definition, it's a variety of molecules within an axon terminal that are released into the synaptic cleft in a response to a nerve impulse, and that changes the membrane potential of the postsynaptic cleft. So we can think of neurotransmitters as chemical messengers of the body. And these chemical messages also known as nerve impulses, will kickstart this message, sending it to the axon terminal of a neuron. And then from there, the neurotransmitters will make their way through the neuron into the bloodstream or a muscle through ion channels. And then from there can carry those messages to the body parts that will need to carry out the act, that these messages, basically the main meat of the message. Neurotransmitters can be classified into two categories based on size. So there's small molecule neurotransmitters and neuropeptides. We're going to be focusing on the small molecule neurotransmitters for this specific presentation. So within the small molecule, there are subcategories as well. And one specifically we're going to look at is biogenic amines. And these will either cause excitation or inhibition. So excitation is essentially depolarization, which is basically turning the postsynaptic cleft less negative, which will eventually bring that up to threshold, which will start an active action potential. And inhibitory, which is hyperpolarized, which is going to make it more negative. Which will do the opposite, won't bring it to threshold, so that action potential will not happen. And so here is an image that's kind of really depicts a really good idea of what's happening. So this is the nerve cell, this is the presynaptic nerve, this is the postsynaptic nerve. And a lot of the meat of what a neurotransmitter does is going to happen in the synaptic cleft, which is the so here we have the axon terminal, which is ending, and these neurotransmitters are in these vesicles that are being released, and then they are binding and able to cross through the receptors of the postsynaptic neuron, and from there can continue on in this chain of messages until it gets to a muscle or will go into the bloodstream. So also another thing to know about it is that, and we'll talk about it a little later, reuptake transporter. So the neurotransmitters will either go back into the presynaptic neuron, or they will diffuse and then later be destroyed by an enzyme, which we see right here. So what happens when we don't get enough dopamine in our bodies? So when the degeneration of neurons that release dopamine degenerate, so yes, we can experience a disorder known as Parkinson's disease. This usually begins to affect victims around 60 years old. And when the caudate nucleus neurons release ACH, which is acetylcholine, the level of dopamine may change, while the ACH will always remain the same. That's a very important thing to remember. It's the dopamine that's going to fluctuate that will cause this disorder. So when when the imbalance occurs, that there's too little dopamine and too much ACH, this is thought to have caused the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, which includes involuntary muscle contractions, tremors, a wide eye expression, unblinking stare, and bradykinesia, which is slow movements. And there's a link to this interesting article in the CDC, which explains and kind of explores the connection between drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, and Parkinson's disease, and how they're finding a connection of people who smoke cigarettes and or drink coffee are less likely to develop Parkinson's disease. So it's pretty interesting. And then what happens when we have too much dopamine in our system? So schizophrenia, which is a psychological disorder, is thought to be caused by excess amounts of dopamine in the brain, which will cause a person to experience delusions, distortions of reality, paranoia, hallucinations, which that kind of ties back to dopamine's original function, which is source of pleasure, excitement. So this kind of ties into that. Another disorder that occurs is obsessive compulsive disorder, which is basically a person has these thoughts that consume them and eventually will take over, and they will have to carry out an action or a behavior. So it's obsessing over compulsions they feel obligated to carry out. And that is a little dive into dopamine, the neurotransmitter. Thank you. And